You step through the bronze doors, and the heat hits you like a wall thick, wet, pressing into your lungs. The marble floor is slick beneath your feet, not with water, but with something else, something oily, something that makes you careful where you step. Around you, hundreds of naked bodies shimmer in the lamplight, their skin glistening with sweat and perfumed oils. Laughter echoes off vaulted ceilings 3 stories high. Senators argue philosophy in waist-deep pools, while slaves scrape grime from their masters' backs with curved bronze blades. A child splashes near the edge, and you notice, though you wish you hadn't, what's floating near him in the water. The Romans called this civilization. They called it the pinnacle of human achievement. You're about to discover why they were catastrophically, magnificently wrong. Before we step deeper into these marble halls, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It fascinates me endlessly that a story from ancient Rome can travel across centuries and oceans to reach you right now, wherever you are. The year is 216 CE, and the baths of Caracalla have just opened their doors to the public. They are the largest, most expensive, most technologically advanced bathing complex ever constructed, covering 27 acres in the heart of Rome. With swimming pools the size of modern Olympic facilities, libraries filled with scrolls, gardens with imported trees, and heating systems so sophisticated they won't be matched for over 1,000 years. The Emperor Caracalla built them to cement his legacy, to prove Roman engineering could transform raw stone and water into paradise itself. Over 6,000 Romans visit these baths every single day. They come from every social class, though carefully separated by time and wealth, to exercise, to socialize, to conduct business, to see and be seen. For many Romans, these baths are more important than their own homes. They spend hours here daily, sometimes arriving in the afternoon and not leaving until after dark. The baths are where reputations are made, where political careers rise and fall, where the entire social hierarchy of the greatest empire on earth performs itself in various states of undress. But there's something the Romans didn't know, something their brilliant engineers and architects and physicians couldn't see. No matter how closely they looked at the water in those magnificent pools, the water was alive. Not in the poetic sense they meant when they praised the living waters flowing from their aqueducts. Alive in a way that would have horrified them if they'd possessed the knowledge to understand it. Every drop contained thousands, sometimes millions, of microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, all thriving in the warm, nutrient-rich environment the Romans had so carefully engineered for human comfort. They had built, with breathtaking skill and staggering expense, the most sophisticated disease incubators in the ancient world. Let's walk through what a typical Roman bath experience actually looked like. Not the sanitized version from history textbooks, but the reality documented in medical texts, satirical writings, and archaeological evidence that tells a story far darker than the gleaming marble suggests. You arrive at the baths in the late afternoon, the fashionable hour for Romans of means. In the apoditerium, the changing room, you strip completely naked and hand your clothing to an attendant, whose job is ostensibly to guard it, though theft is so common that most bathers wear their jewelry into the pools rather than risk losing it. The floor here is already slick with tracked in filth from the streets outside, where human waste, animal dung, and the accumulated refuse of urban life create a paste that clings to every sandal. Next comes the palestra, the exercise yard, where you're expected to work up a proper sweat. Wrestling, ball games, lifting weights. The Romans believed you needed to be thoroughly filthy before the cleaning process could truly work. The logic was backwards, but the belief was universal. As you grapple with other men in the dust, as the sweat begins to pour, you're accumulating exactly the kind of surface contamination that will soon be spreading through the bathing pools. Now the ritual truly begins. Slaves approach with vessels of olive oil, not the fresh golden oil you might imagine, but oil that's been used on dozens of bodies before yours. They pour it liberally over your skin, coating every surface until you glisten like a statue. This isn't a light, moisturizing treatment. This is a thorough shellacking that mixes with your sweat, your dead skin cells, the street dirt you brought in, creating a kind of biological paste. Then comes the stridula curved bronze blade, with a handle passed from customer to customer throughout the day. The slave drags it across your oiled skin in long, firm strokes, scraping away the accumulated filth in ribbons of greasy sludge that falls directly onto the floor. Sometimes it's swept up. Often it's simply trampled into the tile, mixing with the condensation and foot traffic until the floor becomes a thin biological film that never truly dries. But here's what makes your skin crawl once you understand it. That stridule has been used on 20, 30, perhaps 50 other bodies today. Some of those bodies were healthy, others were not. One might have had weeping skin lesions. Another might have been in the early stages of a disease he didn't yet know he carried. The bronze blade that scraped their infections is now scraping you, and any microscopic cut or abrasion in your skin, visible to the naked eye but present on everyone, becomes a doorway for whatever pathogens that stridule is carrying. The same is true for the oil. The vessel the slave carries is communal. Oil that drips off one body flows back into the container, mixing with the oil that will be applied to the next body. By the end of a busy day at the baths, that olive oil has become a suspension of biological material from hundreds of different people, culture medium more diverse than anything a modern laboratory would dare to create. Now you proceed to the tepidarium, the warm room, then to the caldarium, where the real heat begins. The air here reaches temperatures that would impress a modern sauna, maintained by the hypocaust system, one of Rome's genuine engineering marvels. Hot air circulates beneath the raised floor, heating the tiles until they're almost too hot to stand on comfortably. The walls radiate heat. Steam rises from the pools in thick, visible clouds. The Romans loved this room. They believed the intense heat was purifying, that sweating opened the pores and released bodily toxins. They weren't entirely wrong about the sweating, but they had no idea what else was happening in that wet, warm darkness. Every surface in the caldarium is coated with condensation. That moisture doesn't just sit there, becomes a breeding ground for mold, mildew, and bacteria that thrive in humid environments. The tiles you're walking on, the walls you're leaning against, the benches you're sitting on, all of them are covered in a thin film of moisture that hosts countless microorganisms. Some are harmless, others produce mycotoxins that cause respiratory problems, allergic reactions, and chronic illness with repeated exposure. But the real problems begin when you enter the pool. These communal baths are enormous, large enough to hold hundreds of bathers simultaneously. The water is heated to perfect comfort, usually between 85 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It feels luxurious. It feels like civilization itself, this warm embrace after the intense heat of the caldarium. What it actually feels like is the exact temperature range where pathogenic bacteria multiply fastest. Here's what the Romans didn't understand. Every person who enters this pool brings contamination with them. They haven't showered first. The concept doesn't exist yet. The pool itself is the cleaning mechanism, which means that all the sweat, oil, dead skin, Street dirt and bodily fluids each person carries become part of the water that everyone shares, and the water is almost never changed completely. Oh, fresh water flows in from the aqueducts Rome's. Water supply is genuinely impressive, and old water flows out through drains, but the turnover rate is abysmal by modern standards. A single pool might serve thousands of bathers over several days or even weeks before being fully drained and scrubbed. The mathematics of contamination become horrifying once you work them out. One infected person can contaminate water that touches hundreds of others. Those hundreds can then contaminate thousands. The baths function as exponential amplifiers of disease, taking individual infections and broadcasting them across the entire social network of Rome. The satirist Martial wrote about his bath experiences with a mix of humor and disgust that suggests he understood something was wrong, even if he couldn't identify exactly what. He complained about men who urinated openly in the pools, who emerged from the caldarium and immediately defecated at the pool's edge before entering the water. His complaints weren't moral so much as aesthetic. These behaviors were annoying, not taboo, which means they were common enough to warrant literary comment, but not shocking enough to be seriously forbidden. Archaeological evidence confirms what the satirists hinted at. Drain systems in Roman bathhouses, when excavated and analyzed, have revealed exactly what you'd expect and dread fecal material. Parasitic worm eggs, heavy metal contamination from cosmetics, and biological markers indicating water quality that would fail every modern health standard by catastrophic margins. The Romans actually valued urine for its ammonia content. They believed it had cleaning properties, and they weren't completely wrong. Ammonia is a mild disinfectant, but they failed to account for everything else in human waste that makes it spectacularly unsuitable for bathing water. Urea, bacteria, various dissolved metabolites, all of it, entered the pools regularly, contributing to a chemical and biological soup that grew more complex with every passing hour. And then there were the diseases. Skin infections must have spread through these baths like rumors through a marketplace. Ringworm, impetigo, various fungal infections, all of them thrive in warm, moist environments and transmit readily through contaminated water and surfaces. The Romans noticed the pattern. Their medical texts describe skin conditions that seem particularly common among frequent bathers, but they attributed these to bad air or imbalanced humors, never understanding that they were watching person-to-person transmission happening in real time. Waterborne parasites would have thrived beyond measure. Giardia can survive for weeks in water and requires only a tiny infectious dose. Cryptosporidium is even hardier, resistant to many disinfectants that wouldn't be invented for centuries anyway. A single infected bather could contaminate an entire pool. Everyone who shared that water became a potential new host. The Romans suffered from chronic diarrheal diseases. That much is clear from medical records. They attributed these illnesses to various causes, never understanding that they were continuously reinfecting themselves every time they visited the baths. The very institution they believed promoted health was maintaining a cycle of illness that touched nearly everyone who used it. But perhaps the cruelest irony was the social aspect. The baths were where Romans went to see and be seen, to prove their status, to participate in the civilized life of the empire. Not going to the baths marked you as either desperately poor or dangerously antisocial. The sick went to the baths because staying away would have been admitting weakness. The healthy went because not going meant social suicide. So they all went, they all bathed in the same water. They all shared the same strigils, the same towels, the same oil. They all sat on the same benches, leaned against the same walls, breathed the same humid air thick with aerosolized particles from every cough and sneeze, and they called it civilization. The enslaved workers who maintained these baths lived in conditions that would have broken most people. They spent entire days in the oppressive heat and humidity, constantly exposed to the biological emissions of thousands of bathers. They cleaned floors with tools that were themselves contaminated. They handled soiled textiles, scraped diseased skin, worked in close physical contact with infected individuals without any concept of protective measures or disease transmission. We don't have good records of their mortality rates. Roman society didn't consider slave deaths worth detailed documentation, but we can infer. Life expectancy for enslaved people in Rome was already brutally short. Those working in bathhouses surrounded by heat, humidity, and constant pathogen exposure would have been at the absolute bottom of an already dismal scale. The architectural features the Romans were most proud of made everything worse. The acoustics they'd engineered, so carefully allowing voices to carry beautifully through the vaulted spaces, also meant that every cough and sneeze distributed its payload of pathogens efficiently throughout the enclosed rooms. The hypocaust heating systems created damp spaces beneath the floors where mold flourished unseen. The multiple pools at different temperatures that showcased Roman engineering sophistication also meant multiple opportunities for contamination. They built beauty, they built wonder, they built disease vectors of stunning efficiency, all while believing they were demonstrating their superiority over the supposedly unwashed barbarians beyond their borders. The barbarians, lacking the infrastructure for Roman-style communal bathing, probably had lower rates of waterborne illness. Skeletal remains tell the story that Roman pride obscured bones from the period show evidence of chronic infections, repeated severe illness, and systemic health problems consistent with continuous pathogen exposure. Children's teeth show enamel hypoplasia, horizontal lines in the enamel that formed during severe illness, indicating that most Roman children experienced major infections multiple times during their developmental years. Many of those infections likely came from the baths their parents brought them to, believing they were introducing their children to civilization. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the bathhouses fell silent, not because people suddenly discovered they were dangerous, but because no one could afford to run them anymore. The elaborate water systems required functioning civic infrastructure. The heating systems needed constant fuel supplies. The buildings themselves demanded maintenance that only organized government could provide. As aqueducts broke down and weren't repaired, as fuel became scarce, as civic authority dissolved. The great thermes of Rome slowly went cold. The last fires in the baths of Caracalla probably went out, not with any grand ceremony, but simply because no one came to feed them one day. The medieval Europeans who followed didn't bathe as frequently, but when they did, they used smaller facilities with water that was changed more often. Without meaning to, without understanding why, they created more hygienic conditions than their sophisticated Roman predecessors. Sometimes ignorance combined with simplicity is safer than ignorance combined with engineering brilliance. The ruins of Roman bathhouses still stand across what was once the empire. Tourists walk through them today, photographing the soaring arches, the intricate mosaics, the ingenious heating systems visible beneath glass floors. The spaces feel peaceful now, even noble ancient stones basking in Mediterranean sunlight, whispering of a lost civilization. But to see them as they truly were, you need to populate those empty pools with murky water that hasn't been changed in weeks. You need to fill the air with steam and the smell of rancid oil mixing with sweat and worse. You need to hear the constant background noise, the coughs, the splashing, the casual sounds of bodies doing what bodies do when social conventions permit almost anything. You need to understand that this beautiful ruin was once a place where civilization and disease shook hands daily, where the most sophisticated society in the ancient world poisoned itself slowly while congratulating itself on its refinement. The baths of Caracalla operated for over 300 years. Millions of Romans bathed there across those centuries, believing they were participating in something that elevated them above the common filth of human existence. They were wrong. But they were wrong in the most human way possible, mistaking technological achievement for understanding. Confusing the ability to move water with knowledge of what lived in it, building monuments to progress that were secretly monuments to the limits of their knowledge. The marble still gleams after 2,000 years. The mosaics still shimmer in the Roman sun. But if you know what to look for, if you read the medical texts and the satirical complaints, if you examine the archaeological evidence and the skeletal remains, you can see the truth those beautiful stones have always hidden. Sometimes the most advanced civilization is just the one that's learned the most sophisticated ways to be wrong.